You know Walter Kaiser? Has anybody heard of Walter Kaiser? I know two people shaking their head, nobody else. He's an Old Testament professor at Gordon Conwell. I don't know if it's a seminary or, and I saw him speak twice, but one time he spoke at a conference I was at, and he was talking about Israel. And he started to say that, if you realize the Bible, it's like 69% of the Bible is the Old Testament. And he said, and he's an Old Testament professor, and all he really ever talks about is the Old Testament. And he said that one year for Christmas, his kids gave him a New Testament. So I guess if he could go to the New Testament, so can we. And this is Jesus speaking. Truly I say to you that you who followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, so you can see that there's going to be this structure of government. Government is not bad. God gave it to us now. What we do with government is a whole other story. Now, we'll go through this quickly. Like I said to you, I kind of feel like the Gospels really fit more in an Old Testament motif. And Acts is kind of the transitional book out of that, and then we have more of the New Testament epistles. Jesus had lots to say about the kingdom. And I always struggled with this. But again, because we mainly stay in the New Testament, you kind of struggle with it. But if you go back and you see all these things about the Old Testament, then what Jesus is saying tends to make a lot more sense. And so, just kind of, in summary fashion, just talk about Matthew, because kind of really a book really written to the Jewish people. It's going to have the most to say about the kingdom. Really, in chapters 1 through 12, the kingdom is announced. I mean, John the Baptist announces him. Jesus is preaching about the kingdom. But something happens in Matthew 12. We see, really, the nation of Israel rejects the offer of the kingdom. And really, at that point, Jesus' whole ministry shifts. Now he's now preparing for the church. And the parables have a lot to do with that preparation. Through also, he foretells his rejection, crucifixion, and resurrection, and he predicts the church all through this is going on here. He talks about the kingdom in the future, but then he indicates that it's going to be postponed. And there's a parable there where he does that. But through all that, even though the nation rejected him, the triumphal entry, he comes in as the king. What we now know as Palm Sunday, people call Palm Sunday. That was his actually announcement as the king. He came in on a donkey, and then the next kind of thematically he declares his future triumph in the Olivet Discourse. That's what we see, and then Jesus defends his kingship even to his death. And what did they put above him? King of the Jews. So, and then in the book of Acts, what does he come and he do? He talks about the kingdom. So this was very important, not just to the people there, but it was important enough that Luke, who wrote Acts, talks about that in the beginning of, and we've read some of these verses. So just kind of summarize Jesus' teaching on the kingdom. The kingdom is announced. It's rejected by the nation of Israel. It's postponed. He talks about it being postponed. Before he was resurrected, he talks about it being postponed. He's declared king. He suffers for his subjects. And then again, in Acts, he talks about the kingdom being postponed after his resurrection. These are all consistent with the New Testament. A little bit kingdom in the book of Acts. I think we'll kind of skip over that, just keep moving. And then Israel's role in the kingdom. This is from Dwight Pentecost. During the millennial reign of Christ, Israel as a nation will fulfill the function for which they were originally set apart by God. They will become a kingdom of priests who are intermediaries between those who need to be saved and people who will need to be saved in the kingdom, and the king who provides salvation. They will become, as they were originally appointed to be, God's light to the world. And if you notice, we'll talk about that next week in the Feast of Tabernacles, that the nations are going to be commanded to come up, even the millennial kingdom, to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So, Other Old Testament eschatological prophecies. We talked about Jacob's trouble, Daniel's 70th week, resurrection, and that's not the rapture. That's a New Testament mystery. And the timings of the resurrections are not given in the Old Testament. We don't know when if they're going to happen before the kingdom begins or after the kingdom begins. The New Testament kind of tells us that. And then we talked about the new heavens and the new earth on that. And what's interesting is Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and he seemed to know a lot about resurrection. So that's interesting that there's some things that have been lost through the years. I'm moving through this quickly here. Got a few more minutes. We talked about Jacob's trouble, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we get into Daniel's 70th week. But there's six purposes of the tribulation period. Really, it's kind of the transition point between the church age and the kingdom. Out of the tribulation come a remnant of Israel to populate the kingdom, and opportunities for the fullest manifestation of sin. Okay. Wow. The Holy Spirit is removed. There's no restraint on sin in the tribulation. You think it's bad now?
Yeah, you're right about that, man.
And really, why is that? God's trying to show us He is right to judge.
Mm-hmm.
And then God's wrath is poured out against the Gentile nations that have lived in rebellion to Him. And then climax to Earth's history in which God exposes Satan's delusions of man. You know, how Satan has deluded man. And at that point, Satan is rendered inoperative for 1,000 years. Now, it sounds great, these are wonderful things, but gosh, it's going to be a tough time. And just kind of in review here, these are some of the things we talked about. The minor theme is the suffering servant. Major themes, the day of the Lord and the kingdom. The Old Testament does not make a clear distinction between the two comings. And it does that because there's a legitimate offer of the kingdom, and theoretically it could have been accepted, and we could have had the kingdom could have been inaugurated at Jesus' death and His resurrection, but it was rejected. It predicts a unique tribulation, and we're going to get into Daniel a little bit, so we'll touch on that, and teaches a resurrection, and we'll touch on that in Daniel. And I want to go back to here. If you remember this chart that I developed, we talked about. What I want to focus on here is the time of the Gentiles, and we'll get into that a little bit. With the four kingdoms, we'll look at that. We'll go back to that next week. But I wanted to just spend a few minutes, because another book that really has a lot to do with history of the world and how we get from where we're at now to the kingdom is Daniel. And Daniel's an interesting book in that it's not written chronologically. I don't know if you know that. It's written thematically. Now, what New Testament book is also done that way? Anybody?
Revelation.
I think Revelation Revelation does is it is actually chronological, but it does go back and then fill in some of the details. It gives you to kind of tell you what I'm going to tell you and then I tell you. So Revelation I would take as chronological with some points that go back and just give more details. But the book of John is written thematically, not written chronologically. The other interesting thing about the book of Daniel is it's written in there's actually 4 languages in it, because there's some Greek words and there's some
Aramaic.
Aramaic. Oh yeah, there's Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Persian. Yes, but the 2 main languages are Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay, Aramaic was not the language of Israel, the other thing about Daniel is it's written in terms of history and prophecy. Primarily, the first kind of half of the book is more historical, though there's prophecy in there, and the last half of the book is more prophecy. And here I kind of give you a little summary, just to kind of get us into it. Daniel's overview gives you Daniel's history and how he ended up in Babylon. We see this Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue, the fiery furnace, one of the great kids' stories that we tell. Then Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the tree, and then we get taken to a successor, Belshazzar's feast. At this point, Daniel's an old man, in chronologically. Daniel is in the lion's den under Belshazzar. We have then we have some visions all the way through the end of the book here. But what I want to show you kind of thematically, and if you look at this book, that the chapter that is kind of different than everything else here, you start out with Hebrew, you go to Aramaic, and then you go back to Hebrew. So the first chapter is in Hebrew, then the next section's in Aramaic, and then the last section's in Hebrew. And then you have this history and prophecy. So you have this one chapter that overlaps the others. And so you have chapter 7, which is written in Aramaic, but it's prophecy, because all the other Aramaic chapters are history. And so this kind of like, we call this kind of like a hinge chapter. It's an important chapter in the book. And interestingly enough, it relates back to chapter 2, and we're going to spend time. Where I'm going to is the Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue, and the four beast kingdoms are related. And it we'll also get into some of the vision of the 70 weeks here. So, but really, so these are some of the, in terms of prophetically, some of the important chapters in the book. Another little aside, I always like to look at names, and it's something that's important here because God gives them, their names were given by their parents, they're godly names, and then it's very important that when they came into Babylon, their names got switched. And this is why I always advocate biblical names for our kids, so people remember. But Daniel meant God is judge. Some people say means God is my judge, but when he was as part of being in Babylon, they named his name Belteshazzar, and that means may Baal protect his life. And Baal was a chief deity there. So he went from the God of Israel as being fair and judging, discerning, to Belshazzar, Hananiah, and you have the three friends. We always call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but really it was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And look at the name. I mean, you could see their parents were probably believing parents. Look what they would name their kids. Jehovah is gracious. And instead he gets the name Shadrach, which is associated with the moon god. And then Mishael means who is what God is. And again, he gets Meshach, who is what Aku is. And then Azariah, Jehovah helps, gets Abednego, and that's servant of Beno, and that's the son of Baal. So anyway, there's just a little, nothing earth-strikingly theological in it, but I always find a little fun to look at names, and names are important to God in the Bible, and they're there for a reason. And important, so important that they felt they had to change the names to kind of enculturate them into the Chaldean, Persian way of doing things. Forget about the God of Israel. Focus on our gods. It's kind of our gods are greater. So I think we're going to end here. We'll come back here in 2 weeks to talk through the times of the Gentiles and tie Daniel. We'll go through Daniel 2. Daniel 7, and we'll tie them together. We're not going to spend exhaustively, but I want to go through, we're looking at the kingdoms, how this relates to Israel, and so on and so forth. Any questions before we end? Yes?
Why did so many names end in IAH?
I don't know they had IAH back then, but
last-
I know. I know you're saying that the sound.
But I mean, when you start reading it, it's uncanny.
Any thoughts?
Does it mean something?
Yah was short for Yahweh. And I think the I prefix would be a first person pronoun